I remember being at that intermediate level where I could understand conversational Spanish, I had a good base of vocab, grammar, I could conjugate verbs pretty well. But when it came to me speaking, I really, really struggled. I would have long pauses, it'd take me ages to think of what I was going to say, and I had a lot of nerves and just I felt really uncomfortable speaking, despite the fact that I could literally understand conversations and podcast episodes of 20, 30, 40 minutes of people speaking in Spanish. And it was really weird because I knew I had all the knowledge and the skills to be able to speak Spanish, but when it actually came to me being able to speak it and get my ideas across, I'd really, really struggle. And even after those long pauses of thinking of what I wanted to say in my head, when I actually said it, I would make the most basic grammar mistakes that I knew were incorrect, and yet I'd still make them anyway. And then as I was speaking, I realized I was making these really simple mistakes, and I'd just freeze up and have this massive just feeling of embarrassment because of all the mistakes I was making. Yeah, sort of a vicious cycle of just like being really uncomfortable speaking Spanish, but also at the same time being able to understand conversational Spanish. It was quite a weird period and quite confusing, and I didn't really know how to overcome it. If you are at this level, first I want to say congratulations because it's really impressive that you've managed to get to this level where you can understand conversational Spanish. You've done most of the hard work. Now it's just about trying to sort of show off all these skills and all the things that you've learned in Spanish and sort of implementing them, which can be quite hard, but I feel like it's the final hurdle to sort of reaching fluency. And I genuinely believe if you follow the advice in this video, you can basically reach fluency within a month. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy. This is going to be a month of trying to immerse yourself in Spanish, but I think there's only two things you need to do. And if you do them every single day, you will reach fluency in Spanish in a month. Before we get started, I just want to say my name is Rory. I've been studying Spanish for about 4 years now, and I like to think I'm fluent. I've got a couple of videos on my channel of me speaking Spanish, so you can watch them and sort of see where my level's at. I'm not perfect, but yeah, I like to think I've got a decent level of fluency. Without further ado, let's get into the video. So I think there's only two things you need to do to sort of overcome this intermediate level barrier or hurdle, and it is just listening and speaking. And why this is so important and why I think you should only be doing these two things is because you're at a level now where you've done all the grammar work, you've done a lot of the verb conjugations, you've got a good base of vocabulary, and now it's just about immersing yourself in the language. You've got to treat it as if you're basically living in that country, because that is how you reach that next level of fluency. Listening and speaking are the best two ways of doing that. Obviously, if you enjoy reading and other things, you can do that on the side, but I think you should really spend the next month focusing on your listening and speaking as much as possible. And that's what I did. I didn't touch a textbook, I didn't do any grammar work, I didn't really learn any new vocab apart from the listening, which we will get into in a second. But yeah, I just focused on listening and speaking for about a month, and that's how I sort of overcame this barrier of feeling really uncomfortable speaking. And before I get into this, I do need to stress that the listening and speaking are both as important as each other. You can't slack on one and do the other, because I'm telling you, both of these things need to work together in order to help one another. And I'll sort of get into that later into the video as to why the listening helps speaking and the speaking helps the listening. And first of all, let's break down the listening side of things. So personally, I think you should be listening to at least, at the very, very minimum, an hour of Spanish a day. And I know that might sound like a lot, but what you need to do is first of all just look at your day-to-day schedule, and realistically you've got to sacrifice a little bit. So say for example, if you're commuting to and from work, commuting to and from school, you're going to have to replace that time you listen to music or an English podcast or watching YouTube, and you're going to have to put a Spanish podcast on. This might sound difficult and a bit annoying, but these are the sort of sacrifices you've got to make if you want to reach that level of fluency. And I think, yeah, an hour, an absolute minimum a day, but ideally you're pushing for an hour and a half, 2 hours. When you just got that free 10, 20 minutes, you're brushing your teeth, to just put a podcast on for 3, 4 minutes. You know what I mean? If you're cleaning the house, something like that, you can just put a podcast on for 10 minutes in the background. Just the more you're listening to Spanish, the more you get into that habit of doing it, the more you're going to be immersing yourself in Spanish, and the better you're going to get. And the reason I think the listening is so powerful, and you can sort of use the listening to replace the other things of grammar and vocab, is because what you're going to be doing is, the more you listen, you're just going to be solidifying the vocab and verb conjugations that you already know in your head by hearing native speakers speak. And also you're just understanding and developing more of a native way of thinking and speaking in Spanish, because all you're doing is listening to at least an hour a day of native speakers speaking Spanish. And also what's going to happen eventually is when you listen to a certain amount of Spanish, you're going to be able to pick up this thing which is really, really powerful, which is if you're speaking or you're listening to something, you'll be able to know if someone is speaking good Spanish or speaking bad Spanish. You've listened to so much Spanish, you've sort of just picked up this native ear where you've got so used to listening to Spanish and you've immersed yourself in so much Spanish that you can almost just autocorrect what people are saying, and maybe you won't even be able to pinpoint what the reason is, but you can just be like, that doesn't sound correct, that doesn't sound like what I've heard native speakers speak for the last 2 weeks, and I've been listening to an hour of Spanish a day. And you start to pick up these things, and that's where you really start to reach that fluency, where you can just sort of naturally listen to things and be like, that doesn't sound right. And that's the level we want you to get to, and I want you to get to. So yeah, I think the listening is really, really important and will help us with the speaking side of things, which I will touch on later. And my number one tip for this really is, don't listen to music. Only listen to podcasts, unless you want to listen to music when you're with friends or in social environments. But if it's just you, just listen to Spanish podcasts, because you're going to be hearing so many more words per minute in Spanish, and you're going to be hearing actual conversational Spanish instead of lyrics from a song. I genuinely think that listening to 1 hour of a Spanish podcast is better than listening to 3 hours of Spanish music. So just bear that in mind when you're thinking of listening day in, day out. Don't replace the podcast with music. I'm telling you, it won't have the same impact and you won't reach that level of fluency in a month. And now you may be thinking, what kind of podcast should I be listening to? And what I'd recommend is 3 in total. You should have one sort of educational news one that you listen to, and then 2 that you enjoy. And the reason I recommend 3 is just because you want to be hearing different people speaking Spanish. You don't want to be used to the same voice, saying the same sort of phrases and speaking in the same way. You want to be hearing and being exposed to different people speaking Spanish. And the best way of doing that is by having 3 sources. And the reason I recommend one news podcast is just because it helps you to build that sort of formal base of vocabulary and that clear structure of grammar that they're going to be using in the podcast. And also the news covers so many different topics and so many different ranges of themes and conversations that it just helps you to just sort of solidify those bases and expand the amount of conversations you can have. And also just keeps you up to date on affairs in the world as well. So sort of a productive thing of keeping yourself up to date on the news while still improving your Spanish. And then I recommend 2 that you enjoy, just again because you don't want to make this process boring and dull of listening to things. You want to be able to enjoy and listen to podcasts that you actually enjoy and interest you. And then it also is going to help you be able to speak about your interests. If you can listen to people have conversations about things that you're interested in, when it's your turn to actually speak about these things, you'll be able to do that much better and much clearer. Yeah, just becoming too accustomed to listening to one voice and maybe the certain ways and certain phrases that he uses. You want to be exposed to different ways of speaking Spanish and different ways of expressing yourself. So that's why I'd recommend 3 podcasts in total. And I'm not saying you need to listen to one episode of each of those podcasts every day. You can just sort of listen to them as and when. But if you're constantly rotating between these 3 podcasts, I think that's a good enough base to sort of help you improve at a fast rate. And another big issue people have when listening to podcasts is they can easily switch off. And I know I struggle with this a lot. Is I've been listening to a Spanish podcast, and if it was a little bit too hard for me, or if I was traveling to and from school and I had things in my mind, I could easily just become distracted and spend 20 minutes not really absorbed in what the podcast was saying, and it's just playing in the background. I'm not really listening or taking anything in. And this can be really dangerous because you could have had an hour journey of having a podcast in, and realistically, you could have only listened and really absorbed 20 minutes of it. And you're thinking, oh, I've listened to an hour of a podcast, great, that's my listening done for the day. When realistically, you've only absorbed 20 minutes of Spanish. And I have a couple of different methods that you can use to sort of avoid this and prevent this from happening. And the main way, obviously, is just every time you get distracted, just try and bring yourself back to the moment and focus back on the podcast, which can be quite difficult. I think that's the key, is just constantly just trying to bring yourself back and remember that you've got to absorb this podcast. You can't just let it sit and play in the background. You need to be focused and actively listening to it. And secondly, another good thing to do to actually just test yourself after you listen to a podcast and know whether you've really absorbed anything from it, have a notes page on your phone where every time you listen to a podcast episode, just put one thing they mentioned in the podcast. So maybe one joke that stuck with you or one piece of information that they said in the news podcast. And then on top of that, do one thing that you learned Spanish-wise. So maybe there was one piece of grammar that you learned that was quite interesting or you hadn't known before. Or maybe there was one word they used in a different context that you didn't know could be used in that context. There's things like that that you can sort of do to just make you double check and to solidify what you've learned in that video. Hopefully all that information for the listening helps you and it wasn't too much. I know there was a lot in there. Yeah, but I think that if you follow all those tips and advice, you're going to skyrocket your progress in Spanish. And now let's look at the other side of this, which is the speaking element. And by the way, if you are interested in investing a little bit of money into your Spanish learning and want to improve at a much faster rate, you can book a free call with me and we can discuss how you can fit into my one-to-one coaching program. And now let's continue with the video. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, the speaking is the real problem that we have at the intermediate level. You have got a good base of grammar, vocab, verb conjugations, but when it comes to actually speaking, you feel really uncomfortable, nervous, you stumble over your words, you make really simple grammar mistakes that you wouldn't normally make. I think obviously the main way to overcome that is by speaking. I'd recommend you do at least for a very, very minimum 5 minutes of speaking every single day in Spanish. Ideally, you're doing a little bit more. I think 10 minutes is probably the best. If you can do 10 minutes of speaking every single day, you're going to be flying. But 5 minutes at the very minimum is still good. And when you hear this, you may be thinking, oh, I don't know anyone who speaks Spanish, or the friends that I do have that speak Spanish aren't going to be willing to speak to me for 5 to 10 minutes every single day in Spanish. And that's fine because you don't need any of that. You can do it by yourself. And realistically, I think when you're at this level where you feel really uncomfortable and nervous speaking, you don't really want to speak to any native speakers anyway, because you're too embarrassed and too afraid of making mistakes, which I definitely know I was. I remember for a good period, I didn't want to speak to anyone in Spanish. I only spoke to myself and practiced alone, recording myself on my laptop on my camera, because I just felt so embarrassed and I knew I'd make so many mistakes and so many pauses that I wouldn't really want to have a conversation with anyone else apart from recording a video talking to myself. And when you're recording these videos, you can talk about anything. You can just talk about how you feel in that moment, what you've done today, what you did yesterday, what your plans are for the next week. You can literally talk about anything that comes to mind, or you can even go back and tell stories about your past, maybe when you passed your driving test, or I don't know, your first day at secondary school, first day at primary school. All these different things you can talk about and just explain these stories that happened in the past. And all of these things you're slowly building and improving your vocab and improving your verb conjugations and just improving your ability to speak and improving how comfortable you are speaking Spanish, which is the main key that we are trying to overcome at this stage. And if you do run out of topics, because I know for me, after about 3 weeks, you get to the point where you sit down to record a video talking to yourself and you're just sort of like, I don't really know what to say, I've got nothing on my mind. And then there's loads of websites you can just search up saying basic conversation starters in another language or basic conversation starters in Spanish. And what then will come up is just a bunch of questions, a bunch of would you rathers, like what would you do if you won the lottery, things like that. Those kind of questions can come up then, and then you've got a bunch of new conversation starters that you can use in Spanish. Yeah, I think this is the real key, is consistency with this. I mean, obviously there's certain days where you might be busy and you might not have time to sit down and record a video of you speaking for 5 to 15 to 20 minutes in Spanish. What you've got to do then is just double the time the next day. Say, for example, one day you missed it, the next day you've got to make sure you do 10 minutes or 15 minutes in Spanish. You need to be doing this every single day that you can, because that's where you really start to build the confidence and trust in yourself to speak Spanish. And every time you speak Spanish, the mistakes, the pauses, and the uncomfortableness will slowly decrease. But you have to be doing this every single day. And now we're going to link this back to the listening, because as I said before, eventually what will happen is when you get to a certain level of listening, where you've been listening to so much Spanish, you start to develop that sort of native ear where you can pick up when things sound wrong and sound right. Well, this is going to be great help for when you're listening to yourself back in Spanish, because as I've said, we want you to be recording these videos of you speaking Spanish. And what you can do is the next day or an hour later or immediately after, if you want, you can just listen to it back. And immediately as you're listening to it back, you'll be able to pick up the mistakes that you made. And when you say something that doesn't sound correct in Spanish, that's where the listening is really, really key, because you're so used to listening to native speakers speaking in Spanish. When you listen to yourself, you can sort of hear the differences between the native speakers and where you are. And then you can slowly start bridging that gap between where you are and where you want to be and where you want to reach that fluency. So that's why it's really, really important that you do these things together, and you don't just do 5 minutes of speaking a day, or you don't just do an hour of listening a day. You need to do both of these things, because then they work together, because all the listening that you're doing is going to help you correct and improve your Spanish. And then ideally you make a couple notes on what the main issues were in the 5, 10, 15-minute video that you were speaking in Spanish. You make those notes of what you did wrong and what you could improve on, and then the next video you try and implement them. And that is how you're going to reach fluency in Spanish. But yeah, my main tip for this is don't worry if you make 100 mistakes, and don't worry if it takes you 10 minutes to say 10 sentences. Don't worry about it. All this is improving. Every single time that you sit down and you do the video, and maybe you spend 2 minutes without actually speaking because you just feel so uncomfortable talking in front of a camera and you feel so uncomfortable speaking Spanish that it just takes you a while to just start speaking. That's fine, because your mind is still forming those connections in your mind of forming sentences. And every single time that you do that, the pauses will decrease and your confidence and your ability to speak Spanish will improve. So you just got to overcome this difficult period. And I think this is the hardest bit. The hardest bit is sitting down and speaking Spanish to yourself for 5 to 15 minutes when you know you're going to make a bunch of mistakes, and it's going to be messy, and it's going to be a lot of pauses, and it's going to be a lot of simple mistakes. But you've got to do this. Yeah, I'd highly recommend you do these things every single day. And I genuinely believe if you do a minimum of an hour of listening every single day, ideally you're doing close to 2 hours, and then 5 to 10 minutes, ideally 10 again, of speaking every single day, you will reach fluency in a month. I genuinely believe that, because that's how I did it. That's how I reached fluency in a month. Again, I was probably doing a bit more speaking. I was probably doing about 10 minutes every single day roughly, and then the listening, I was doing a lot of listening. I was doing at least 2 hours a day, because I was doing a lot of traveling for football, and my football team plays quite far away. I'd spend that whole time listening to Spanish to and from. That can be anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours of Spanish every single day I was absorbing, which was absolutely amazing for me. So yeah, I think these things are really, really important. And if you follow this advice correctly, you will reach fluency in a month. But yeah, I hope this video has helped you. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, you are at the final stage. You've done really well to get to this stage. Now it's just about showing off these skills that you've learned, because you have done all the hard work. Now it's time to show off and just get to that stage where you can start speaking to the natives. This is the time where it's enjoyable and you can start having fun with your Spanish. So yeah, enjoy it and have fun, and I'll see you in the next video. Hasta la próxima. Adios.